You hear me?
We can hear you. How you doing,
Great,
Mr. Tharpe?
Great. Thanks. We're doing great. Thanks very much for inviting me on.
It is indeed an honor to speak to you, and I know I actually spoke to you a little bit to get some of your comments as we did a tribute show last month to Mr. Moody, and we thank you again for doing that. And tonight we wanted to make it all about Mr. Tharpe and the NWA.
Well, ask any question you've got in mind.
All right, Austin, I'll let you fire away with the first shot, so go for it, buddy.
Austin, I wanted to ask you, when you started, falling in love with professional wrestling, what got you into it?
How did I get started in professional wrestling?
Yes, sir.
What got you interested in professional wrestling?
Well, I was born in the business. My father was involved in professional wrestling in Florida, so some of the earliest memories that I have of as a child are of going to the wrestling matches with my father. My dad was he was a very close associate of Eddie Graham in Florida, so I can remember going to the wrestling matches with my dad. I mean, my father was the ring announcer, so he would ring the bell and he would introduce the matches and whatnot. So from the age of 3-4 years old, I mean, I can remember going to the wrestling matches with my father. And Lou Fez held me when I was a little baby, and I was around a bunch of legends of the day when I was just a kid. So that is how I got involved in the wrestling profession. I began working for the Florida office, the wrestling office myself, when I was about 17 years old. Eddie Graham hired me, and I worked up in the wrestling office with Duke Kiyomuka, who was a famous Japanese wrestler, big card in Texas back in the day, one half of the World Tag Team Champions, and actually the father of Pat Tanaka. I worked with him.
Really? Wow.
Yes, I worked with. And Pat, back then, was just a little, he was just a teenager back then. He wasn't even in the wrestling business yet. But I worked with his dad in the office for about 4 to 5 years while I was in undergraduate school. And that's, sort of my background in the wrestling business in Florida.
Very cool. Go ahead, Austin. Go ahead.
So was your dad actually a part of the NWA at that time, or was he a part of another wrestling organization?
No, my father was part of the NWA.
Wow.
So, yeah, absolutely, and he knew Sam Muchnick, who was a very famous president of the National Wrestling Alliance. So that's one of the reasons why I take my job with so much responsibility, is that the tradition of the NWA dates back, And when I speak of myself, I'm speaking of myself and my partner, Chris Ronquillo. He's the vice president. And he and I are totally on the same page when it comes to respect with regard to the National Wrestling Alliance. And this is one of the reasons why the two of us as a team stepped up to the plate to try to restore the NWA to its position of prominence that it held several years ago.
That's actually awesome. And I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned working in Florida. Did you get the opportunity to meet or work with Gordon Solie? Absolutely.
I did television with Gordon Solie every week for about 5 years.
And he was definitely one of the greatest play-by-play men in the business. From everybody that I've ever talked to and read about, they've had nothing but good things to say about him as far as how he would, call a match, and just, Jim Ross credits him for his success as well.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, with all due respect to Jim Ross, who is a phenomenal play-by-play man, I considered Gordon Solie to be the icon, and I was so fortunate to be able to work with him on a weekly basis for about 5 years and watch him and learn from him. I did commentary with him on several occasions, and
that must have been intimidating.
It was very intimidating for a 17, 18-year-old kid. I'd say I was about 18 when I sat down to desk with Gordon Solie, and you bet it was intimidating. But it's an experience that I'll never forget, and he was a memorable character, an icon in the business. He's gone, obviously, but and I saw a picture of him, I guess it was on Facebook yesterday, believe it was his birthday yesterday or something like that, and I saw some pictures of him on Facebook. And I was just, brought back a lot of memories. It sure would be nice to sit down and do an interview with Gordon these days. But.
Absolutely. They didn't call him the Dean for nothing.
That is correct. He's great. And I worked a lot with Dusty Rhodes back in the day. Terry Funk was in Florida quite a bit. Kevin Sullivan, of course, I worked closely with him. And as you know, Florida was one of the hotbeds of professional wrestling back then. Most of the top names of the wrestling profession made their way through Florida, and a lot of it had to do with the lifestyle. And the towns were a lot of fun. The weather was usually beautiful. The guys could enjoy the beach and whatnot. So yeah, most of the top stars in the business made their way through Florida.
And was there relationships, like friendships, that were built upon your time in there? I mean, obviously you mentioned a lot of big names in there. Do you keep in contact with some of them names now? Or, I mean, you mentioned Dusty and Terry and so forth. And, I mean, do you keep in contact with them, say hi from time to time and so forth?
Well, there are a few. Kevin Sullivan came down to take a look at the National Wrestling Alliance probably about 3 to 4 months ago. And he spent about 3 days with us. And he's an old friend. I mean, I've been on the road with him a lot. So when you're on the road with people long periods of time, you develop close relationships with them.
Absolutely.
And Kevin Sullivan is one of those guys. Terry Funk is another one who has known me since I was 17 years old, one of the greatest world champions of all time. And I see Terry Funk usually at the Cauliflower Alley Club meeting in Las Vegas every year. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to give a little plug to the Cauliflower Alley Club. They are a benevolent association that does a lot for professional wrestlers that need assistance for certain things, be it surgeries or health care or even rent. Sometimes they've helped people with.
Absolutely.
So they're a great group, and I attend there. I'm a lifetime member. I attend every year, and in fact, what we're planning on doing next year, we don't have it organized completely. Mr. Ronquillo and I are working on that as we speak. But what we're trying to do is schedule our NWA annual meeting the same time that the Cauliflower Alley would be meeting next year. So all of our NWA membership could meet in Vegas and then just stay on for the next couple of days and enjoy meeting all the legends that attend the Cauliflower Alley Club meeting.
That's awesome. I've heard really great things about the Cauliflower Alley as far as men who have actually been honored with awards and so forth. And just recently, I believe it was Jake Roberts that recently got invited to the Cauliflower Alley several months back. That's the most recent one that I can think of, but I know there have been other names.
Chris Ronquillo and I were there for that, and Jake Roberts gave a very rousing speech, and talked about, the rough road that he's been on, since he's been in the wrestling profession. But we certainly wish him the best and that he continues on the right path.
Absolutely,
but talking
one
about
of the great wrestling minds.
Definitely. But we were talking about relationships that have developed in the business. One of my closest friends in the business, who's gone now, was Jack Briscoe. He was my idol when I was growing up. The scientific wrestler, the figure 4 leg lock, the clean-cut NWA world champion. He was my idol growing up. And because of my father's relationship with the Florida Wrestling Office, he also actually became a friend of the family. Jack and his brother Gerald both, and they knew my mom and dad really well, and my brother, and so they are both very close. Close. Of course, Jack has passed away, but Jerry is doing really good. He's been working with WWE for many, many years, and he's still one of the right-hand men. So he's a great guy. Another. Sir Oliver Humperdinck was another great friend of mine who's
another great manager too. Absolutely.
Absolutely, I knew him for many years. He knew me when I was a kid, and so it's kind of fun to reconnect at Cauliflower Alley with him and reminisce about the days when both of us were younger. Another guy that I spent a lot of time on the road with and developed a very close friendship with was Mark Lewin, the Maniac Mark Lewin. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you guys, but he was also known as the Purple Haze in Florida, and traveled a lot with him. Bill Alfonso, the referee at that time, it was before his managing days, and one of the best referees ever in the National Wrestling Alliance was Bill Alfonso. He and I spent many, many times on the road together. Another very close friend who we lost, who I spent a lot of time on the road with, was David Von Erich. David Von Erich had come down to Florida from Texas, and he and I hit it off, and every Sunday he'd pick me up and we would go to Orlando, to do the wrestling and drive back together every Sunday night, like clockwork. He was a
Did you
great
actually
guy.
get a chance to work with the Von Erichs? I mean, besides David, with Fritz or Kerry or anybody like that?
Well, Kerry passed through Florida several times, but I never, and Kevin did on occasion, but never really worked with anybody else much. I never had much contact with the Dallas office. In fact, I didn't have any contact whatsoever with the Dallas office while World Class was still in existence.
Gotcha.
But I worked a lot with David, and he was a great wrestler, had great psychology, was a phenomenal athlete. He was a natural. Obviously, genetically he was Fritz Von Erich's boy, because he was a natural in the ring.
Absolutely. I mean, all of Von Erichs definitely had their share of talent, and some shine more than others. And I know Kerry went on briefly to the WWE, and then of course, as you mentioned, he passed away in 1993. But out of all of this, you definitely have quite the history and quite so many. You have a lot of stories I can imagine you can tell. Have you ever considered even writing a book, or have you written a book?
I have not, but when I find the time, I'd like to think about something like that. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with Scott Teal. He has written a lot of wrestling books. He wrote the Ivan Koloff book. Pardon?
That name does sound familiar, actually.
Yeah, he is an author, a wrestling author from Tennessee, and he has written a book on the assassin Jody Hamilton, Ivan Koloff. He did the book with Downtown Bruno. He did the Lou Thesz rewrite of the Lou Thesz book Hooker. I mean, he's a phenomenal author. And I actually had breakfast this morning with him in Nashville, Tennessee. I was in Nashville last night for an NWA Southern All-Star Wrestling card, NWA SAW card, in which Iron Man Rob Conway successfully defended his world title against Chase Stevens. And met a lot of great people there. Yeah, met a lot of great people there. And they're shooting television, and made a little television appearance there for them, and really enjoyed the experience. I'm actually doing a lot of traveling these days.
I have noticed that. We follow you on your Facebook and see the great pictures that are taken. You were recently in Japan as well. Have you? Right. I mean, because I know Rob was actually a prior guest on our show a couple of months back, and he's doing really well as your guys' World Heavyweight Champion. And does he have an upcoming show coming up, or you guys have an upcoming show coming up?
Well, we actually do. We're very pleased with the relationship with New Japan. We've developed a working agreement with them, and I don't necessarily. I don't think I'm at liberty right now to actually give out the specific dates, but we've got several bookings already between now and the end of the year. Personally, I'm going back 3 times between now and the end of the year. So wow. That would have meant, by the time I reach, January 1st, I would have been to Japan 5 times this year, trying to develop the NWA and try to get more exposure for it. So, we're out there working really hard. And Chris Von Grillo made the trip with me. Last month we were in Osaka for a pay-per-view in which Rob Conway defeated Nakanishi, who was a very formidable challenger, has an extensive amateur background, tough competitor, and really gave Rob a tough match, very tough match, but he was able to pull it out, hit the ego trip, and pin him 1, 2, 3, and He's also wrestled and defeated Kojima. So, and that was at the Sumo Palace in Tokyo on April the 7th. And I was there for that as well. And yes, he's got a few more dates scheduled in the future because our goal is to wrestle the best that New Japan has. I mean, he is the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. You know, we believe that he is the best, you know, he represents the best wrestler in the world today. So the only way to prove that is to meet and defeat the very best in the ring. And that's what he's doing. He's traveling. You know, he defeated Nakanishi and Kojima in Japan. You know, Rob Conway has defeated Chris Masters in Houston. Yep. He's defeated Vegas in San Antonio. He defeated Damian Wayne in Marion, Ohio last week, and he faced Crimson in Toledo, Ohio, defeated him. Last night, the Iron Man defeated Chris Stevens in Millersville, Tennessee. So, you know, the list is going to continue. It's going to go on and on. He's a fighting champion in the short time that he's had the belt. You know, I think that he's done really well. We're very proud of him, and we think that he represents the NWA very well. I know that it means so much to the Iron Man to be the NWA World Champion. It means a lot.
It does. It really does.
He respects the history, you know, the lineage of the brand, and you know, for him to be among the elite of wrestling, which he certainly does, you know, he has proved that he belongs among wrestling elite, means a lot to him. And
absolutely,
you know that we're very proud of him as the NWA World Champion.
You know, the NWA was, without a doubt, one of the more formidable opponents of the WWE back in the 80s as far as competition went, because they put on some phenomenal shows back then. And at this point, you guys are headed in the right direction to one day be a formidable, not necessarily opponent, but more to give people more of an option to watch besides WWE. Because at this point, I mean, on TV, they for the longest time, they've really been the show. But
exactly.
Don't let that fool you, because I'm sorry, go ahead.
Felix, you said it exactly correctly. You know, we're not out to try to attack or defeat, or, you know, all we want is our share of the market. There's enough to go around. WWE
Absolutely.
has a product that's extremely successful, you know, and has been for many years. You can't argue with success. But we do believe that there is a market for an alternative product out there, and we think that's where the NWA may fill a niche in the United States and worldwide, actually.
People still are. You have quite the following for the NWA, the old school fans, the new school fans, and I think that just says something right there. The NWA is not planning to go away anytime soon, or for that matter, ever.
Well, the NWA dates back to 1948. It is a brand, you know, a recognized brand that dates way back to 1948. You know, in Sam Muchnick and Tiki George and Lou Thez and Strangler Ed Lewis and guys like that, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. And, you know, that is a brand that is still in existence, just like Harley Davidson is an established brand. The NWA is recognized worldwide. And if you talk to hardcore wrestling fans about, you know, what are your favorite matches from the past, I guarantee you most of it will be NWA matches. You know, because they're going to be talking about
absolutely
Harley Race and Ric Flair and Jack Briscoe, and, you know, that's what this brand dates back to. But we are headed into the future. We are looking forward to the future. We are. I'm traveling around a lot. I'm meeting a lot of wrestlers that I've never met before, never seen before. I'm scouting a lot of talent. We do have plans within the very near future to launch a television product. Mr. Ronquillo and I are working on that.
Awesome.
We're not close yet to doing it. We've got to produce the product and then get it distributed. But that is on the drawing board. We've got an awesome website that just debuted. For those of you who haven't seen it, check out www.nwaringside.com, and we've got some. It'll redirect you to a really good merchandise site where we've got some really nice NWA polo shirts that everybody is ordering those, and some really good T-shirts and stuff like that. You can check out our merch, and this is a website that is evolving, and we are anticipating eventually putting a television product out on the website as well as other broadcast vehicles. So those are some of the things we've got on the drawing board.
That I was going to ask. I was going to do a quick name association, if you don't mind. Something new I wanted to try. You've met and worked with some of the big names, the great names, the wrestling legends of the past and present. I just want to throw a couple names out there, and first word that comes to your mind, fire away, and if you're okay with that.
Sure.
We'll start off. Well, coincidentally, you mentioned the name of Harley Race.
One of the greatest NWA world champions of all time. Harley Race was not trained formally, would be the word I'm thinking of, but he was trained by Stanislav Zbyszko. I don't know if you've heard that name.
I actually have.
Dates back to the 30s. He's a former world champion even before the National Wrestling Alliance was formed in 1948. But Harley Race, when he was a young teenager, probably 14, 15 years old, wanted to be a professional wrestler and left home and went to, I believe, their farm in Missouri and trained with Stanislav Zbyszko and his brother. And so he was not formally trained like an amateur wrestler might have been, but he was one of the toughest wrestlers of all time. I mean, he was a bad guy. I mean, he was a good person, but in terms of getting in that ring once the bell rang, he was a tough guy and defeated a lot of people. He defeated a lot of non-wrestling people. There were people that who thought they were tough, that wanted to break into the wrestling business or challenge wrestlers, and Harley defeated a lot of those guys too. I don't know if you know about that.
They don't call him one of the toughest ever for nothing.
I'll tell you a couple of stories, and I think he probably got him with the same move. There was a guy in Florida who was supposedly a karate expert, okay, and he was sitting on the front row and he was challenging the wrestlers week after week after week after week. And finally Harley challenged him, said, if you think you're so tough, get in the ring. Well, the guy came, I guess, the next week in his karate gi, and he actually got in the ring and he struck a pose. Yeah, karate pose. And Harley just headbutted him. It was over with. Just gave him one headbutt to the bridge of the nose, and it was over with. In Oregon, the same thing happened, but this time it was a motorcycle gang that showed up at the matches, and they were challenging all the wrestlers. And once the matches were over with, these motorcycle guys didn't leave. They stayed there. And I think Matt Bourne, who just passed away, went out there, and he got in the ring with a couple of the guys, and he pinned a couple of them, but they still were, laughing and being disrespectful. So Harley was standing there, and he said something like, "Oh, Matt, come on, why don't you just hurt one of these guys?" Can you hear Harley saying something like that in that voice of his? "Oh, come on, Matt, just hurt one of these guys." So Matt, so one of the motorcycle guys says, "Well, why don't I take you on for size? I wanted to challenge you anyway. Harley was the world champion." So he says, "Well, give me your biggest guy." Biggest guy got in the ring, and he lunged at Harley. As he lunged at him, Harley just lunged forward also, and again, he headbutted him right on the bridge of the nose. And Harley said his nose just exploded.
Oh, my God.
There was blood everywhere.
One of the worst places to get hit.
And that's right, and just broke his nose, I'm sure. And the guy was knocked out, and his motorcycle buddies just carefully kind of just picked him up and carried him out, and that was it. So Harley was one tough son of a gun. Yeah, Harley was one tough son of a gun. And not only that, I don't know if you realize this, Harley was in several motorcycle accidents when he was younger.
I had heard something about that.
And he had a steel plate in his right forearm, and he had a steel plate in his head. So if he headbutted you, or if he hit you with that forearm, he was hitting you with steel. And so,
holy cow.
Yeah, he was a tough guy. He was a tough guy.
That is definitely one of the great stories, probably the greatest story I've heard so far while I've been hosting this show. And I can't speak for Austin, but I have to say thank you so much for sharing that, because wow, that's amazing. I've always been a fan of Harley, and I continue to be. And I was just so glad to see him get inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame the same year of Bobby the Brain Heenan. Those two guys, Bobby, did you ever get a chance to work with him at all or even meet him?
Never, no, not before he was out of the business. I never met Bobby Heenan.
But those two together were great.
But I was a big fan of his, I'll tell you that much. I was a huge fan of Bobby Heenan. I think he was one of the greatest wrestling managers of all time. Man, there was a lot of great wrestling managers too that sort of fit into the same category. J.J. Dillon and Charles Humperdinck and Gary Hart. I would have to throw those in there. Gary Hart is another guy who I became very close friends with prior to his death. But I actually became acquainted with Gary after he was out of the wrestling business. He and I, Sir Oliver Humperdinck actually brought us together. But he was a wonderful guy who passed away way too early.
So would you consider yourself a Bobby Heenan guy?
What do you mean a Bobby Heenan guy?
Well, let me put out a reference to you. They usually use this reference towards Paul Heyman. They call a Paul Heyman guy. I use this reference in this case of an old school manager, so I refer to it as a Bobby Heenan guy. But
I'd say more of a Gary Hart guy.
Hey, that's an even better choice. Gary Hart I don't think he gets the credit he deserves. He was actually one of the better managers way back when.
He was, he certainly was. He broke into the business and in and around Detroit, I believe. But he had been a competitive swimmer before he got into the wrestling business. And as you know, he was involved in a plane crash with Buddy Colt and some of those, Buddy Colt, but where Bobby Shane passed away, and Mike McCord was the fourth guy that was in that plane crash. But Gary Hart helped all three of those guys get to shore. So
I didn't know that.
He sure did. He had a broken back and lacerations all over his body, a severely broken ankle, and because I talked to him about it before he passed away, and I believe it's also in his book. If you have a chance to get the Gary Hart book, it's one of the best books ever on the market. A phenomenal book. But the plane went down, and Gary popped up to the surface and swam, a few hundred yards, I guess, to the shore. But apparently he could hear the guys calling, "Help me!" And so he swam back out there, and he got them. He got Buddy Colt and Mike McCord, and of course Bobby Shane never made it out of the plane. But he assisted those two guys getting to shore. So Gary Hart was a hero in my book.
I think I actually heard that same story from the World Class DVD that WWE put out a couple of years ago.
Yeah, true story. True story. It's funny how the Lord prepares us for certain things, but he had been a competitive swimmer before he got into the wrestling profession. And I guess that was one of the things that he and I had in common, because I also was a swimmer. That was my sport when I was in high school, so we would talk about that, and we had a lot of different things in common. He was a great guy.
And the last name I want to throw at you, actually I'll throw two names at you. First name would be Vince McMahon.
Well,
as far as that word association. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Wow. What an icon in the business. What totally changed the face of the wrestling profession. He's a genius at the wrestling profession. There's no question about it. Took a family company basically and took it public, and he's been on national television longer than any other running, episodic television program. He's got the record. So my hat's off to Vince McMahon. He's the hardest working man in the wrestling business. I understand he never takes a vacation. And he expects all of his employees to work as hard as he does. So he's a great man.
And the last one I want to throw at you is Jim Crockett.
Senior or junior?
Well, how about the Crockett family that you might have probably even worked with them or even met Junior and probably his brother too. Did you ever get a chance to work or meet with the Crockett's?
I met Jim Crockett maybe once or twice, just very briefly. But Jim Crockett Sr. was an icon of the business. He was on the NWA board of directors. Had one of the most successful territories in the country. He ran the Carolinas for many, many years. His booker was George Becker. His booker was George Becker. The assistant was Johnny Weaver, and it was a tag team territory. And a lot of the guys were, midweights, junior heavyweights, lighter type wrestlers. And they made a change towards the end of the 70s, like 1977 perhaps. Brought in George Scott as the booker. George Scott brought in Johnny Valentine and Wahoo McDaniel, two singles, big guys, tough guys that would, used to hit hard and like to get hit hard back. And some of the most brutal, vicious matches ever were in the Carolinas, and those two guys basically built the Carolinas. After that, and Blackjack Mulligan came in, and then the Masked Superstar, and Paul Jones was there, and Jimmy Snuka was there, and just a phenomenal territory that was. They would run 2 or 3 towns a night at one point.
Yeah.
When they were really spinning along. So Jim Crockett Sr. was the man who developed that. They used to call him Big Jim because he was about 400. He was about 400 pounds. So they
that I didn't.
Big. Yeah, he was a big man, heavy man. Yeah, he was about between 300 and 400 pounds. And then, of course, when he passed away, his son, Jimmy Crockett Jr. and David Crockett took over, and they developed, they developed it into a national corporation, and he later sold to, I believe, Ted Turner, which they became WCW. I think that's how that went.
And
was it? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I know Bill Watts sold the UWF to Crockett, and then I think Crockett sold to WCW, something like that. The corporation, that's what it was. The Time Warner Corporation bought from Jim Crockett.
But before I let you go, Mr. Tharpe, I was wondering if it's okay, if you don't mind, because I do have a caller calling in. Would you mind taking a question from a fan?
Not a problem. Be happy to.
Okay, we have one caller calling in, so we'll go ahead and take that real quick. Hello, you're on the air with Bruce Tharpe, the NWA president. Do you have a question for him? Hello?
Hey, how you doing, Felix?
Hey, is this Jorge?
Yeah, this is Jorge from, if you don't mind, Reality Check Radio. How are you, man?
I'm good. Did you have a question for Mr. Tharpe?
Sure. How you doing, Mr. Tharpe? How are you?
I'm doing great, sir. And yourself? How are you tonight?
I'm doing great, sir. Putting up with the Miami weather. But basically, Mr. Tharpe, I wanted to ask you, with the NWA growing as much as it is currently right now, is there anyone particularly that you might be wanting to work with in the future in the NWA? Like someone that the NWA hasn't worked with yet?
Like, what are you talking about?
Like, for example, just how the TNA has been releasing a bunch of their superstars due to financial, then taking a backseat to financial depth, and then WWE releasing a good number of guys like Trent Beretta. Is there anyone maybe in the future that maybe the NWA has probably put an eye on and say, maybe we want to work with this guy in the near future as maybe a challenger?
Sure, absolutely. I met with Michael Tarver in Florida about 2 weeks ago. Was very impressed by that young man. He worked with WWE for a number of years. He's a very experienced wrestler, trained in martial arts, and his father was a professional boxer. And very impressive young man. I'm taking a look at Michael Tarver. There's a number of wrestlers that I've seen in New Japan that I'm interested in. One of which is Prince Devitt. He is a phenomenal junior heavyweight wrestler. I met a number of really good wrestlers that are already in the NWA in Toledo and in Marionville. Marion, Ohio, and Millersville, Tennessee last night. A lot of wrestlers that I had not met before that would like to move up the ladder in the NWA. The NWA championships are very prestigious. The world title is very prestigious, including, the national championship, the women's championship, the North American title. They're very prestigious, and there's a lot of competition out there to hold those belts. So
absolutely.
I completely agree with you, Mr. Tharpe. I completely agree. As a matter of fact, till this very day, Felix, with your permission, can I say something that happened on my show with your permission?
Sure. We've got a couple of minutes left. We don't want to take too much of Mr. Tharpe's time. Go for it.
Okay. Well, basically, Mr. Tharpe, when I had one of your former champions on the air, the gentleman that Mr. Conway beat for the title, Mr. Cahagas, I was actually speaking with him, and I was actually talking with him about how I still believe to this very day that the NWA Heavyweight Championship is still a lot more prestigious than any WWE championship for that matter. So I completely agree with you when it comes to what you just said about the title, sir.
Yeah, I agree as well, and the fans in Japan agree as well. The NWA has a long lineage and a long history, and it is prestigious. You know, from Lou Thesz to Terry Funk to Jack Briscoe to Dory Funk Jr., the list goes on and on. I can't name, all of them, but a prestigious list, and Bob Conway certainly fits because he's done a great job defending that belt, and I know that there's a lot of high-profile opponents that are lining up for matches against him in the near future all over the world.
Well, Jorge, I appreciate you calling in, man, and if you want to just hang tight and listen to the rest of the show, you can do that.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing that, Felix. No worries. But, hey, Felix, very, very great show. And, Mr. Tharpe, thank you so very much for answering my question, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jorge.
All right. Well, that was Jorge, a good friend of ours. And I want to say, Austin, did you have any final questions for Mr. Tharpe before we let him go?
Yeah, the last show, I know we're going to close to time, but I want to ask you, did you have a hand in helping TNA when they first started in 2002? Because I knew they were part of the NWA.
I was not involved in the NWA at that time.
Oh, you weren't? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you
were. No, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what happened is, in a nutshell, I worked in Florida in the wrestling business full time for about 5 years, from '79 to '84. In '84, I came to Texas to go to law school. I'm an attorney, and I've been a practicing lawyer for 27 years. And when I went to law school, I, in essence, retired from the wrestling business to go to law school. But for those of you who don't know, I mean, the wrestling business gets in your blood, and it's hard to get out of your blood. So within 2 weeks of being in law school in Houston, I was knocking on Paul Bosch's door and went to work for Paul Bosch in Houston for the Houston wrestling office. So I worked for Paul Bosch all through law school. And then when I was an assistant district attorney in Brownsville, I actually did some wrestling myself in Mexico because I wanted to know what the experience was like to get in the ring myself. And so I did a little bit of wrestling on the local level in Mexico and promoted some shows in South Texas. But in essence, I was out of the wrestling profession for a while, developing my law practice, and decided to get back into the wrestling business I'd say about 10 years ago. And then about 3 years ago, I decided to join the NWA, which is what precipitated me taking over as president. That's
awesome. And I just want to ask one last question before we let you go, is if fans want to follow you personally as far as your social media goes, do you have any social media plugs that we can go ahead and throw out there for the fans if they would like to keep up with you?
Sure. You just do a search on Facebook of our Bruce Tharpe, and my Facebook page should come up. Anybody that sends me a friend request, I will accept. And you can. I post a lot of pictures there from my travels in Japan and things like that. So please, anyone interested in that, shoot me a friend request, and I will accept it.
All righty. Well, Mr. Tharpe, it has been a great time. We speaking with you. We kind of went over the 30 minutes that we agreed to. We apologize for that. We have had a great time. You've been telling some great stories, and hopefully we hope to see a book of yours out in the very near future because, I can speak for Austin as well, saying this, that you'll have two people definitely buying your book, and
First
even Jorge for that matter.
First of mine.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that, guys, and it's my pleasure being on the program. Thanks again so much for inviting me.
Much respect, Mr.
Not a
Tharpe.
problem, sir. You have yourself a great night and safe travels.
Thank you. Good night and God bless. Bye-bye.
Good night, sir. Good night.